Alright, welcome back everyone. So today we'll continue our basic understanding of Blender and just go more in detail about the software itself and try to understand its features and begin working on our projects. So today we'll be talking about the windows on the sides that you see here. We'll talk about modifiers, which is very important when creating a Blender project. We'll create some add-ons and add them. It will just basically make your life easier when using Blender. And then lastly, we'll go over render settings and then render something ourselves at the end. So firstly, let's talk about the windows. So on our right, there's mainly two windows that you should see from the beginning. So the first one is basically your file, and this is where you can see all the objects that you've created. So for example, when you select the cube over here, it also highlights in here. And what you can do with this is either hide it, so now it disappears in your project. You can do the same by pressing H, it's a shortcut, and then Control Z to bring it back. And also, if you hidden multiple things and you want to bring them back, all you have to press is Alt H, and it brings your entire unhidden files back. So here again, you can see all the names. You can rename stuff. This is very useful when you're working on big projects, especially if you have different scenes. You can make different folders like you see here and drag these objects into the folders itself. And the way you make folders is by selecting objects and pressing M, and you can see that you can make a new collection from here. Similarly, if you want to select everything, all you have to do is press A and press M again to make a collection for it. Alright, so that's your scene collection. This is where you see everything. And for example, if you want to hide something from rendering, you can just press this camera icon right here and it does the same thing. Alright, so now let's head down here to scene. This is where you basically decide your settings for your renders and also your viewport. So first let's start from the render engine. And this is basically the quality of your render. So for example, right now we're in cycles, which is the better version, and you can see that there's the computer's very slow because it actually calculates the lights. But for example, for Eevee, it's less powerful, so it's easier to control it, but it's less realistic. All right. So now once we're in cycles, let's go ahead down to viewport, and you can see here that there's max samples. And in Blender, samples is basically how many times the computer runs the simulation and how accurate your render is. So for example, in viewport, I try to keep it pretty low because it's not as important. Because in viewport, you're just trying to see if the lights are affecting the object properly. So for now, we have no objects here, or no lights here. So for example, if I add light, you can see that the lighting changes of the object. So that's why viewport's useful. But for the actual render, you usually keep it a bit higher just because it's your final product, so you want it to be very good looking. And here you can see the denoising check mark. You press this on, and what it does, it basically cleans noise off your renders. And noise are just very annoying small dots that you could see on your renders, and that's basically your computer not being able to calculate those areas. And denoising just fills those spaces, so it's more realistic and accurate and consistent. So other than that, most of these settings can be intertwined. They're not very important. Obviously, once you get more complicated and more advanced, you could start working with, for example, motion blur, lighting path, and things of that sort. But for now, all you have to worry about is just the max samples for your render and your viewport. So after your render settings, you head down to the scene for the output properties, and this is where you can choose your resolution. So for example, on Instagram, the resolution is different from YouTube, for example, or you just want a more or a better quality picture. So for example, if you want to do 2K, 4K, you just multiply this value by how much you want it to be. And online, if you look up the pixel ratio for those samples, it should show you the correct numbers. And you could also just simply do it by increasing the percentage. So the more you increase the percentage, the better the quality gets, but the longer it takes to render the actual project. So the frame rate here is mostly for rendering animations. So the faster you do, obviously, the more it's going to go through um, the cycles, but the smoother it's going to be. And then the frame range is basically for animations as well. So how long you want your animation to be. And the way you calculate that is by dividing the end by how many frames you will have. And then that's how many seconds your animation will be. The output is simply where your renders will save, and then you could select your compression, color depth, all these complicated things. Just you can just copy my settings for now, but if you want to go more in depth, there's plenty of videos online that actually explain how these work. So other than that, let's head down to the world settings. So here is your units. This is useful when, for example, you're working with inches instead of meters. You could change that. You could change the scaling. For degree, for rotation, you could choose between different options. Um, that's the main thing, and then also your camera. So, for example, you can have multiple cameras here. So if we add another one, so we have two right here, and then let's grab this one. Right? You could select which camera you want your main camera to be, and this is the one that's going to render. So for example, now that it's switched from the basic one, I could change it here, and then the camera changes based on where we are. Alright, so next, let's talk about our modifiers. So modifiers in Blender are useful tools that save you a lot of time. So I'll just go over the basic ones that you need to know. The rest are useful, but most of the times you won't be actually using them. So let's start with arrays. So the way you add modifiers is simply by pressing add modifier and then picking the one you want to add. So let's start with arrays. And you can see here that it popped up the array modifier, and you can see that the cube got bigger. So what array does is basically it copies the object over and over again in a certain direction. So for now, you can see that it's factor x, so it's moving in the x-axis. So for example, I wanted to make a cube that's going up. I would have to press 1 on the z-axis and it would go up by 1. And you could also increase this so there's a distance between them. And then your count's basically how many times it multiplies. So the longer you want it to be, the more you add to the count. And that's how arrays work. So the reason this is useful is, for example, you're trying to make a brick wall. Instead of individually copying each brick and placing it down, you could just make an array like this, and then you could just make another array, for example, and instead of it going to the left, you make it go up, and then you could, for example, shift it a bit to the side so it kind of creates a pattern. Arrays are very useful also when you're making curved objects. We'll talk about that more in detail later on, but that's just how arrays work. Our next modifier is the beveling modifier, and what it basically does is bevels the edges. So we've talked about this, how you do it manually by going into edit mode by pressing tab. Oh, sorry, I just realized I didn't have my screencasting on. So you do that by pressing tab, and then you do Control B, and it starts beveling a single edge. So for example, you want to do that to all the edges. You just do the bevel modifier, and as you can see, it does it to all the edges. And you could control how much you want to bevel. So if you want to make a different shape, or how many segments there are. So the more segments, the smoother it is, but the more complicated the object is itself. So that's how beveling works. So our next one is mirroring. This is very useful when, for example, you want to have two objects perfectly away from each other, or for example, if so let's create a subdivision here, and then let's cut one of the sides here. So for example, if you don't cut it, and then you create a mirror modifier, and the side y-axis, it replicates the side onto the opposite side. So let me just go back and start explaining how mirroring works. So when you create the mirror modifier, you could select which sides you want this to rotate on, or which side you want it to reflect on. So, and then what you can do is select a mirroring object. So for example, let's add a monkey and move it a bit to the side. And let's say let's say we want to have two cubes on the opposite side of the monkeys, and we want them to be exactly on the same distance. What you do is you select the mirroring object, you click this icon, and then you select the object you want it to mirror across on. And as you can see, it reflects it on perfectly. And let me just delete these cameras so it's easier to see. And you can see that it's perfectly mirrored across. And then, for example, you want to do something on the y-axis, you move it around like this, and you can see that it's going that way. Same with the z-axis, you can do something like that, and then x-axis like that. So mirroring is very useful, especially when you're working around an object. So let's say we want the monkey to have an earring. Well, first we press shift right click to set the creation on the earring, and then on the ear, and then we create a torus, for example, right, for the earring itself. And we want this to copy on the opposite side exactly the same way. What we do is we mirror, and then we select the monkey, and as you can see that it mirrors perfectly to the opposite side. And also with mirroring, for example, there's also clipping. So sometimes when you're working close up, and let's say that we cut the torus in half, and it's not quite perfectly done. So for example, it bisects some of these parts, and then we extend these, and then we decide to mirror it. So as you can see, it kind of bisects here. So what you do here is you select which axis it bisects on, and it should fix it. And clipping just also does how much it merges on. So for example, this also merges the things instead of just cutting it. Very useful. So like that, the higher the value, the more far apart they can merge, but the less accurate the object will stay. So that's the mirroring. Now let's head on to, so let's fix this. All right, so now let's do solidifying, and this is very useful when working with planes. So as I mentioned from the previous lesson, planes are just two-dimensional cubes, but with planes you have more options to kind of shift the form and shift the shape. So for example, I'll show you later on, but you could add reference images, and then from adding reference images you could change the vertices in a way where it matches the object. So for example, I don't know, we're just doing something, right? So let's just say it's a fish, and then so one other thing is when you're trying to bevel vertex itself, you do Control Shift B, and you can see that it only bevels that specific thing. So let's just say this is a fish, and we want this to be a 3D object instead of a 2D plane. What we do is we add the solidify modifier, and then you could add the thickness to it, and you can see that it gets thicker and is now a 2D or a 3D shape instead of a 2D shape. And you could also mess with a bunch of other options, but the core of solidifying modifier is just to make a 2D object into a 3D object. And yes, the same could be done simply by selecting, so you press faces and then A to select all the faces. The same thing could be done by extruding this, but the reason you use modifiers in most of the cases is it saves you time, and also it's very easy to revert back and also to change anything you want with this. So for example, the solidifying modifier, so let's just say we want it to be this thick, and then later on through the project we either decide we don't want to solidify this, or we decide that we want it to be longer. and you simply can just change it by sliding this left and right, or you literally could just remove it by deleting the modifier. As in, if you do this, um, and you decide to change it, you have to go manually select all the vertices and then delete that. And then sometimes it could cause issues with UV unwrapping, which I'll go into detail later on as well. So modifying things is the easier way of making changes and then not having to worry about reverting back, since Blender has a limited amount of Control Z's you can press. And after solidifying, there's subdivision modifier, and this is basically, so let me make a sphere here. So as you can see, the sphere is not very smooth. So the way you could make this more complicated of an object is by adding a subdivision modifier. So right here, you could see that there's more faces now, and you could change that based on how complex you want the object to be. And there's also a rendering option and a viewport option. So similar to how you try to keep your render quality down in a viewport, you do the similar thing with this. So it doesn't weight down your project too much, and you can still keep working on it. So it doesn't crash, or it doesn't take up too much space. You usually try to keep it on a lower level and then increase the level for the render itself so it's more accurate. And also, one other important thing, since we're talking about subdivision and creating smooth objects, is when you when you right click, it gives you an option to shade auto smooth. And whenever you do that, you can see that the object smoothens out. And it's very useful, for example, with any complicated object. So for this monkey, we shade auto smooth, and as you can notice, there's less faces that you can see. And then if you add a subdivision modifier, you can see that the monkey is actually becoming even more complicated, and there's less faces that you can see. And then based on how many subdivisions you add, you can see that the curves are becoming smoother, and the face of the body, or the face itself, is just becoming much more smoother and much more complicated as in compared to this. And then lastly, let's talk about the curve modifier. And what the curve modifier does, it curves an object based on it curves an object based on a predetermined curve. So, for example, we do a path, and we decide to rotate this a bit and do something like that, and then we select the pen, and then we drop it onto this object itself. You can see that it curves the object as it goes through the thing. Curve modifier is very useful when you're trying to curve a pre-existent object. So for example, we have a wall here, right? So let's just say we've created a wall with a bunch of bricks, and we want this wall to curve around this circle. What we do is we add the curve modifier, we select it here. As you can see, it kind of stretches out this way, but it doesn't cover the whole thing. And this is where the array modifier comes in handy. So you select the array modifier, and then instead of fixed count on the fit type, you do fit curve, and then you select the pen and you select the curve itself. And as you can see, it starts becoming the length needed to occupy the circle. And then what you do here is make sure that the curve modifier is below the array modifier. And as you can see, once you select, so it goes around the circle. And then the more complicated the shape gets, so for example, we add more vertices, the smoother the rotation is and the less noticeable the object is. Texturing, and as I promised, we'll go much more in detail for this video and actually talk about how you can create interesting variations with texturing in Blender. So as mentioned previously, you create a new material, you name it whatever you want. I would recommend you to be specific with colors as you increase your project size, just so, because whenever you create too many objects, you have to start looking through them, and it's easier just to search for it. But anyways, so the basic color is, it just changes the color of the object. That's pretty standard, but as you can see, there's a lot of other varieties that you can change. So the metallic slider makes the object more metallic. So um, let's go into render view to actually see what it does. Just a quick lighting tip. So whenever you want to see the object in light, but you don't want to spend time creating the actual lights and making sure it's working, all you have to do is press this shading tab and then uncheck these marks. So the metallic one just makes the object look more metallic. Um, you won't usually have to mess with the specular as much, and same with specular tint, but roughness is very important since that decides how much light reflects off the object. So as you can see here, the less roughness, the more reflective the object becomes. And then as you turn the roughness up, you can see that there's no light reflecting off of this. And then besides roughness, metallic, there's also transmission. And what transmission does is it makes the object pass through. So right now lights are passing through this object, so similar to glass. So let's add a plane behind this, and as you can see, you could see the plane through the object. So that's what transmission does. All right, so before we go on any further and start talking about the complicated ways of changing your object, let's first enable the Node Wrangler add-on. So the way you do that is by going to Edit, Preferences, and then Add-ons right here. And then all you have to do is just type in Node and then turn on Node Wrangler. This is going to come in very handy when working with texturing your objects. So now that we've done that, let's go into the shading tab. And let me just give you a quick rundown of what these windows are. So the one in the bottom right here, this is the main one, main window. This is where you're gonna add all your textures, things of that sort. The right window from here is the same from the actual layout itself. And then on the left side, this is your UV map. And then so this is where, like, whenever you add texture, this is what it's gonna look like. And then here's the files where you could import your pictures from. Personally, I like to open the file itself and then import the pictures from there, but regardless, it doesn't matter how you do it. So now, so first you obviously have to create the material to see this pop up. So for example, if you don't see anything, that just means you haven't created a material or you haven't assigned one to this. So there's many things you could do. So first of all the shortcuts and the sliders I talked about from here are also on these nodes. And what you could do from here is similar to how you add objects in a viewport. You could do Control or Shift A, and you see a bunch of options here to add different textures of sort. So for example, we want to add a Musgrave texture. What you do is once you add it, you connect this dot to the so there's several things you can connect this to, but to see how it directly interacts with the object, what I do is connect it to the base color. And then as you can see, so the black and white is basically what the texture does. And then you press G to move this around, obviously, similar to the object. So what you can do is either use this for roughness. So as you can see, it adds depth to your texture. Or what you could do is create textures with this. So the way you do that is by adding first the texture you want, and then in the search tab, search for a color run. And then once you add it here, you could actually change the colors. So for example, you want 2 different colors. So what you do is like this, and then it creates variety to your texture. So instead of just having one color covering the whole thing, you could have several colors. So, and then you could always add more by pressing this plus button, and for example, a different color. And as you can see, the way you slide it is how it interacts with the object. So if you want more defined blues, you bring the blue closer, and then if you want more kind of fading color, you keep them far apart from each other. Or if you want more defined red, you bring the red closer, like this. Let me just turn the textures down so you can, not, or the roughness down, I mean, just so it's easier to see. And then, so for example, you could mess around with these textures. So there's a brick texture you could add here. So you delete it with X. So as you can see, it does the same thing similar, just with different colors. But so if you look from the side, you can see that something's not right. It's stretching here, and in some instances it doesn't do anything. So this is where Node Wrangler comes in handy. And the way you activate that is by pressing Control T. And as you can see, that there's two nodes that add on to your actual texture. So first we're going to take a look at this. And what it is, it basically decides how the texture is applied to the object. So there's the generated one, which basically the computer assumes how you want it to be. There's the normal, so it's based on your direction of your faces. There's the UV map, which is basically how the object is cut into. It's basically how the object is cut in the 3D space into a 2D world. So the last three, you don't interact with them as much. The ones I usually use are UV and then generated. Just sometimes because an object's very hard to UV unwrap, which we'll talk about later on. So I just do generated, and usually it produces decent results. And then there's the mapping. The mapping is basically it's the scale of your texture and the location and the rotation. So let's just say that we want this to turn 90 degrees. We go here and just shift these values. So for example, we want it to stand upright, so we just make it 90. And as you can see, it rotated. You could also mess with how the texture, which part of the texture is laid upon each side by moving these. So you can see the colors are changing. And then also you can mess with the scale. So for example, you want more bricks on each side, you just increase the scale, and then same by decreasing, there's less bricks on each side. So that's how you create textures and change the base color. You could do the same thing by simply, instead of this color ramp, you directly insert it into the roughness. And as you can see, what it does is it creates roughness based on the texture, which is in black and white. And to see the texture, all you have to do is press Control Shift and then hold on the object itself. So as you can see, it shows the actual textures in black and white, and then there's some gray areas. So the way it works with roughness and height, white is usually the more roughed up or higher height, and then black is the less rough, lower height. So in this case, so the way you cancel this is by pressing Control Shift and then on the main BSDF. So that's using the built-in textures to create more variant textures. What if for our instance we want to upload a picture from online and import it into our object? So we open up our file. So once we find a texture we want to import into our file, what we do is simply just grab it from the file and just drag it in, and it creates this texture which you could apply to the base color. And as you can see, it automatically just changes the whole thing. And also if you use Node Wrangler, you could change the scale, and then you could do similar things with instead of UVing, you generate it. And then also the same thing could be applied. So online, there's specific websites where you can download textures either for money or for free, and they come in with normal maps and height maps and roughness maps, And what that does, it basically interacts with not only the color itself, but also the roughness, similarly to how this texture would. So the way you would do that is by pressing Control Shift T, and this opens up your file. And from here, we select some texture. We select these, and then we set it up. So as you can see, it automatically does all of this simply by using Node Wrangler, and it creates roughness based on where this shape would be less or more rough. And the way you could see that is actually by right here, looking at the roughness. And then at the final product, you could see that it looks like there's depth to this. And the reason that is because there's a normal map and a displacement map. And if you increase the strength of this normal map, you could see how it almost feels like the sand's actually coming out of the object. And if you increase it more, it's more obvious to see it. Same with the displacement. The more you increase it, the easier it is to notice the actual imperfections of the surface. And that's how you create textures for your objects really quickly. All right. So besides the standard principle, there's several other things you could use to make different objects. So for example, you want to make a light shader or a light texture. What you do is you click on this, and instead of principle BSDF, you look for emission. And what emission does, it basically works as a light source. So the more you increase it, the brighter it gets. You could also change the color of this object. So similarly, you could also add textures to this. So like that. And let's use our node wrangler just so it actually works properly. And let's use a different texture just so it's easier to see. All right, like that. You could see that it basically creates a light source coming out of this, and then you can increase the strength. And there's several other ones. So for example, glass. It's a quick way of getting a glass shader without having to go into detail. There's several other ones you could work with, but the main ones I use is glass, emission, and also the principal one, the standard one. And then okay, so like I mentioned, there's a UV map for each object you create. So first we'll start with the basic cube and then advance to the monkey just so it's a more complicated object. And the way UV maps work in Blender is basically what it does, it cuts the 3D object in a way where it creates it into a 2D space. So let me show you right here, and this should pretty much explain how it works. So that's what the computer does. So you can see right here that it creates the UV map of this cube. And this is how your textures get added to your object. It treats each single face as a different location. So that's why sometimes you could get seams where it doesn't look perfect. There's one issue with this is sometimes where, let's just say we decide to modify this and create a different shape. So now when we press all the faces, as you can see, the actual 2D version of the object doesn't change, but our 3D space has changed. So whenever you try adding textures to this, it's gonna look very weird. And the way you fix this is simply by selecting all these vertices and then pressing U as a shortcut, and then either unwrapping it, and in some cases this works, but in some cases you can see that it doesn't actually change. So what you do is you do Smart UV Project, and you can see that it changes the whole layout of the 2D version of this cube. So let me show you an example with the monkey itself, just so it's easier to see. So you can see that the face is right here. It's split from the ears and from the eyes. There's gonna be a bunch of seams. So here again, you could do Smart UV Project, and you can see that it spreads it more individually. Sometimes using Smart UV Project isn't the best just because it's done by a computer, so it doesn't exactly know what each side is supposed to represent. It just splits everything. So sometimes you have to go manually the in the object and create seams. So what you do is you press Alt and then you click on the edge and it goes all the way around like this. And then what you do is you mark a seam, and as you can see there's a red line going through. So now whenever you unwrap it goes, what it does, it basically treats this as a knife cutting this object through this line, and then it unwraps from that point on. So similar to this, and then so the more seams you add, um so yeah, let me show you, the more the object forms the way you want it to be. Alright, so this will be all for this time. I hope you guys learned a lot of new information, and I hope it wasn't too overwhelming. So for this week, I'd like to give you a challenge of creating a house and using all the skills that we've learned so far.